The HOA freaked out because I had a simple trampoline in my backyard and fined me, saying it didn't fit in with the aesthetics of the neighborhood. At first, I tried to ignore them. I knew that technically my property was still within the boundaries of the HOA, but let's face it, who cares about an outlying ranch? I never went to meetings. I never participated in votes. And, honestly, I didn't care about rules about the color of mailboxes or the type of grass allowed. My farm wasn't a suburban backyard surrounded by neighbors fighting over every detail, so I thought no one would care about my existence. Apparently, I was very wrong. It all started because of a trampoline. A trampoline. A piece of rubber with springs. Something that absolutely no one with a shred of sanity would bother with. My son wanted one. He had seen one of those videos of children jumping, laughing, being happy, and decided that he wanted to experience the same taste of freedom in the air. Like any parent who isn't a monster, I went out and bought a gigantic trampoline. The kind any child would dream of having. I set it up in the backyard, well out of anyone's sight. And that was that. The boy loved it. He jumped, laughed, expended energy, and, above all, didn't spend all day on his cell phone or complaining of boredom. Victory. Or so I thought until I received the letter. The envelope had that pretentious HOA logo, as if it were a parallel government in charge of everything. Inside, a fine of $1,500 and an official notice. The trampoline violated the community's guidelines, not in keeping with the aesthetics of the neighborhood. I had to read it 3 times to understand. I mean, I live on a farm, a place where wooden fences, dirt, cows, and tractors predominate. What the hell does a trampoline have to do with aesthetics, if no one can even see it? I was so disgusted that instead of calling to complain, I did something even worse. I ignored it. I just threw the letter in the garbage can and got on with my life. But they didn't give up. The following week, another letter. This time, doubling the fine. On the 3rd week, an HOA inspector showed up at my property, as if he were a police officer investigating a heinous crime. He wasn't there for a robbery, a fight, or anything serious. He was there to inspect a trampoline. I stood there, looking at that middle-aged man with a clipboard in his hand and an expression of superiority, and I realized that I could react in one of 2 ways: comply, pay the fine, and destroy the trampoline. Declare war. If you think I chose option 1, you clearly don't know me. I wasn't just going to keep the trampoline. I was going to take it to a level that this HOA would never forget. I knew they wouldn't stop. The HOA was like a parasite, an infestation that sucked away any joy a person could have with their own property. What bothered me wasn't even the fine itself, because money could be found. It was the principle of the thing. I was being penalized for something that didn't bother anyone. The only person who could see that trampoline was my son, and I guarantee he wasn't offended by the neighborhood aesthetic. But the HOA wasn't satisfied with just the fine. They wanted me to feel like they were in charge. After the 3rd letter, formal notices started appearing in my mailbox, little pamphlets reminding me of the importance of visual harmony in the community and how to maintain a pleasant environment for everyone. Translation: we are a dictatorship of half a dozen bored pensioners who have nothing else to do but make life hell for those who are happy. It wasn't long before I received my first official visit. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was in the barn looking after some tools when I heard the sound of a car pulling up near the house. It wasn't anyone I knew, at least not personally. She got out of the car with the posture of someone who was about to give a lecture on proper behavior in public spaces. Her blonde hair was tied up in a bun so tight it looked like it was sucking blood from her brain. She was wearing a ridiculously formal blazer for a place where the main social activity was the occasional barbecue. She was holding a tablet, as if she was about to present me with concrete evidence of a war crime I had committed. "You must know why I'm here," she said, without even greeting me. I did, and frankly, I was enjoying myself. "Why do you want to give me an award for having the happiest son in the neighborhood?" I retorted, crossing my arms. She didn't even blink. Your trampoline is still in direct violation of HOA rules. You've already been fined 3 times, and you still haven't made the necessary adjustments. Pause for thought. Necessary adjustments. As if it were a clandestine factory of illegal chemicals. She continued, if there is no compliance within a week, the HOA will take further action, which may include legal action against you. And that's when I knew it was time to react. I could have argued. I could have said that my property wasn't visible to anyone. I could have even tried to argue, but I knew it was no use. She wanted me to fight, because that would give her the perfect excuse to make me a problem. So I just smiled. Oh, that's all right. I've got a great plan to solve this. She raised an eyebrow, suspicious, but apparently pleased that she thought she had intimidated me. After she left, I went to my son, who was happily jumping on the trampoline, completely oblivious to the fact that the neighborhood was about to enter a new Cold War. Son, I called out, what do you think of the idea of an amusement park? He stopped jumping right away. Like a real park? Like a real park. His eyes lit up. And that's how I started planning the biggest affront to the HOA that neighborhood had ever seen. The next morning, I made some calls. I had contacts who could get things interesting. One acquaintance had a small events company that specialized in temporary structures for fairs and festivals. I asked him if he could rent me some attractions for a few weeks. He was silent for a while before asking, do you want an amusement park? Yes. On your ranch? Yes. Man, you're a genius. In less than 2 days, the trucks started arriving. First came the inflatables, a giant castle, a slide almost 4 meters high and a ball pool the size of a small lake. Then there were the bigger toys, a detachable carousel, a portable Ferris wheel, and a metal structure for a climbing circuit. Oh, and of course, lights. Because what's a park without a light show flashing at night for everyone to see? While the workmen assembled the structure, I sat on the balcony and watched with a satisfied little smile on my face, knowing full well that someone somewhere was already foaming with rage. And I was right. The next morning, I barely had time to drink my coffee before the phone rang. It was a number I already recognized. The HOA wanted to speak to me urgently. Of course they did. Now it was no longer a trampoline hidden in the backyard. Now it was a fucking amusement park in the parking lot of my farm, and I was nowhere near stopping. The moment I picked up the phone, I knew exactly what was waiting for me. The voice on the other end sounded tense, as if it were holding back a fit of rage. We need to talk. Now, of course, I replied, exaggerating my friendly tone. But not over the phone. Why don't you come by? I'm sure you'll love what I've done with the place. There was a silence. I could feel the hatred coming through the line. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I closed the phone and went out to admire my masterpiece. What was once just a quiet ranch now looked like a mini version of Disneyland. There was a slowly spinning Ferris wheel, an illuminated carousel playing lively music, an inflatable slide that looked like a monster devouring happy children, and even a cotton candy stand. My son had been having the time of his life for a couple of days, and I was more than satisfied with my work. Then she came. She drove up to my property in an imported car that must have been bought with the money from the absurd fines that the HOA slapped on the neighborhood. As soon as she stopped, she got out of the car with the most indignant expression I'd ever seen. If there was a scale to measure HOA fury, it was at the explode with hatred at any moment level. The woman stood still for a few seconds, looking around, trying to process the scene before her. "What the hell is that?" she finally blurted out. "An amusement park," I replied, smiling as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She blinked, still processing. Her voice faltered for a moment. "Did you really turn your property into a playground?" "Of course. And look, without a trampoline." She squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to keep her composure. Do you think that's funny?" "Quite funny." It was at that moment that I realized she didn't even know where to start. The HOA had prepared a whole strategy to pressure me with the trampoline, but now I had done something so absurdly out of their control that they didn't even know which rules to invoke to stop me. She picked up the tablet and began frantically scrolling the screen, looking for some clause that would prohibit me from having a Ferris wheel in my parking lot. But there was nothing, and that was what was killing her. "This can't go on." She stared at me, furious. "Of course it can. There's no rule against it. And, if you think about it, I'm not even in the residential part of the HOA. Technically, my parking lot shouldn't even be under your regulations." I saw the exact moment she realized I was right. The HOA, in its eagerness to rule over everything, was trying to regulate a piece of my property that shouldn't even be under their domain. And now that I had done it, any action against me could be considered an abuse of power. She knew that. But of course, she wasn't going to admit it. "This is an outrage," she exclaimed. "The community can't allow this kind of thing." Ah, but there was the rub. The community loved it. If there was one thing I knew about this neighborhood, it was that people were tired of the HOA. People didn't say anything because no one wanted to get fined or harassed. But deep down, everyone hated the stupid rules. And I had just given them something no one else had the guts to do. The chance to get even. The neighborhood kids had already started showing up, some accompanied by their parents, who pretended they were there just to look, but deep down were just as excited as their children. I had even set up a scheme. The park was free for any resident who had already received a ridiculous fine from the HOA. The result? The whole neighborhood started showing up. People I'd never seen before started bringing chairs, sitting in the shade, and enjoying the spectacle of watching the HOA lose control. The woman looked around, seeing all this happening before her eyes, and I could almost see the impending nervous breakdown. "It's not going to stay like this." She finally let go, pointing a finger at me as if she was about to turn me into ashes. "We'll take legal action against you. Be my guest." I shrugged. I'm sure the lawyers would love to see an HOA trying to close down a playground out of sheer pettiness. It was the first time I saw her really hesitate. She knew I was right. Any attempt to sue me would be a public relations disaster for the HOA. It was enough that everyone complained about them all the time. Now, with a park set up on my farm and the discreet support of the residents, they couldn't afford to attack me directly, but I knew she would try. She turned around, got back in her car, and sped off, probably already running to the HOA's emergency meeting to try to come up with a plan. Meanwhile, I stood there, crossing my arms and watching the Ferris wheel spin slowly in the background. Whatever they were planning, I was ready. I knew that the HOA wasn't just going to accept defeat and move on. These people live for the pleasure of controlling other people's lives, and watching their little tyranny crumble in real time was probably eating away at their souls. So when the formal notifications arrived in my inbox, I expected it. They had gathered everything they could find to accuse me of something. Excessive noise. As if an amusement park in the middle of a farm was noisier than the deafening lawnmowers on Saturday mornings. Improper land use. As if there were some law that says a farmer can't set up a slide for his own child. Disturbance of public order. Oh, right, because a merry-go-round and cotton candy are the new national threat. But the best part was the final warning. They gave me a 72-hour deadline to dismantle everything, or they would take legal action to restore harmony to the community. Do you know what I did? Absolutely nothing. I continued to operate the park as normal. My son was having fun. The neighborhood kids were showing up more and more. The parents were sitting in the folding chairs enjoying the shade, and, for the first time in years, the neighborhood really felt like a community. The HOA, however, was falling apart. Over the next few days, I would see board members driving by, writing things down on clipboards, taking pictures, whispering to each other. They were desperate, and the more I ignored their ridiculous notifications, the angrier they became. Then, finally, the big moment arrived. The morning after the deadline, the woman showed up again. She got out of the car looking like she was about to give me a final ultimatum. Only this time, she didn't come alone. She'd brought a lawyer. Ah, now things were getting fun. The guy looked exactly like you'd imagine an HOA lawyer to look, wearing a suit, looking like he knows everything, with the arrogant posture of someone who's used to intimidating ordinary people. He didn't even try to be friendly. "Sir, we have received formal complaints about the negative impact of this irregular development," he said, looking around as if he were in the middle of a garbage dump, and not in an amusement park full of laughing children. I crossed my arms. Irregular how? He opened a folder and pulled out some papers, leafing through them as if he was about to destroy me with a fatal argument. According to the HOA's clauses, any significant structural modification to residential properties must be approved by the committee before implementation. I laughed. Structural modification? A trampoline was structural modification? He frowned. This is no longer a case of a trampoline. This has become an unauthorized commercial space. Commercial? I'm not charging anyone a penny. I saw the hesitation in his gaze. They were trying to bring me down, but they had no legal basis. Then came the final blow. He looked at the HOA woman and then back at me, trying to sound authoritative. "You have 24 hours to dismantle all these structures, or you will face legal action." And that's when I threw my card on the table. In fact, I spoke to the town hall. And do you know what I found out? The HOA and the lawyer looked at each other. I continued, feigning innocence. "The area where I installed the park is not part of the residential zoning. It's a commercial rural zone." Their silence was delightful. "That means the HOA rules don't apply," I continued, already enjoying myself. "And it means that if I want to expand here and open a real park, you can't do anything at all." The woman turned purple. The lawyer started flipping through the papers again, desperate, as if he could find a magic clause to bring me down. But there was nothing, because the HOA, in its infinite arrogance, had never really researched the limits of what they could and couldn't control. They simply assumed that they could call the shots, and now they had just lost. The two of them stood there, not knowing what to say, while I just watched the scene, trying to hold in my laughter. After a few awkward seconds, the lawyer snorted. "Well, in this case, there seems to have been a mistake of jurisdiction." The woman from the HOA looked at him with pure hatred, realizing that not even her own lawyer could save her. With nothing else to do there, she stared at me one last time and said through gritted teeth, "It's not over yet." "Oh dear," I replied, smiling. "Yes, it is." She turned on her heels and marched back to the car, stomping hard as if she were about to explode with rage. The lawyer, already defeated, followed close behind. That evening, I held a small celebration. I invited the neighbors, put up more lights in the park, and turned up the music just to provoke. And indeed, the HOA never tried to mess with me again. The woman still tried to maintain the pose that she was in control, but after this public humiliation, her reign crumbled. Members began to leave the board. Neighbors began to ignore the absurd rules, and, within a few months, the HOA ceased to exist. It was beautiful to see. As for me, well, my son still has the most insane amusement park any child has ever dreamed of. And now, whenever a neighbor comes over to have coffee with me, he points to the Ferris wheel and asks, "So, what's the dumbest thing the HOA has ever tried to ban in your house?" And I answer, with a smile, "A trampoline." And that's how a simple toy became a symbol of my revenge against the worst HOA in history. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave your comment and your like below.